Welcome back, focused learners, to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating. We're going to explore this profound, kind of invisible architecture that shapes our entire world. We're looking at the deep, deep connection between how we teach language as humans and how our machines are now generating it. We'll be unpacking some really eye-opening studies from English language teaching and computer science to see exactly how human history, gets coded right into our tech. Let's get into it. So, I want to start by asking you something. Is language ever truly neutral? I know it's a bit of a philosophical hook right out of the gate, but it challenges this fundamental assumption we almost all have about how we communicate. We tend to think of language as just a tool, right? Like a totally neutral vessel we use to pass information back and forth. But as the research we're looking at today proves, that is literally so far from the truth. There's this fantastic insight from our source material that perfectly sets up our core narrative for today. It argues that language is a living, breathing phenomenon that actively constructs our reality. It happens within social, historical, political, and cultural contexts. Basically, every single word we use, every grammatical rule we teach, it all encodes historical hierarchies. It's never just a code. It's an artifact of human history. Which brings us to Section 1, the native speaker illusion. To really wrap our heads around how bias works in practice, we first need to look at the human side of language teaching. Okay, so a totally crucial concept to grasp here is what researchers call native speakerism. They define this as a chauvinistic ideology in language teaching that basically elevates the so-called native speaker as the absolute gold standard. And the problem here is that by doing this, it automatically marginalizes non-native teachers. It establishes this deeply biased cultural foundation where we just assume that one specific cultural lens is somehow superior to all the others. And the fallout from this ideology? It's huge. It creates massive inequity for highly qualified non-native teachers. It enforces biased language norms, distorts the whole cultural foundation of education, and actually embeds logical fallacies right into the way we teach communication. So, why does all this matter for our explainer today? Well, it proves exactly how human prejudices become hardwired into our educational systems. And honestly, that sets the stage perfectly for what we're looking at next. Moving into Section 2, the AI mirror. We've established that human language and teaching are full of structural biases. So, what happens when machines inherit that language? This brings us to a really critical concept called algorithmic racism. This is basically the perpetuation or even the amplification of racial inequalities through digital tech. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Algorithms are often perceived as highly objective, right? Pure math, totally neutral. But the researchers point out that algorithms don't just exist in a vacuum. They are embedded in social and economic structures that have already been shaped by historical and racial hierarchies. Which leads us to the ultimate question for us to think about today. If human language is inherently biased, and if algorithms just absorb the structures they're trained on, what exactly happens when we train large language models on our collective human output? Do they just learn the grammar, or are they learning the prejudice too? To figure that out, researchers set up this brilliant transdisciplinary experiment. They took major LLMs, think GPT-4, Llama, Sabia, and prompted them to just write a simple, short story. But here was the catch. They specified the main character as either a black woman or a white woman. Then, instead of just running some automated word count, they applied a qualitative, human-led framework to analyze the deep meanings and ideologies produced in both the English and Portuguese outputs. Section 3. A tale of two prompts. This is really the core of our explainer, where we look at the wildly different results the AI generated from those nearly identical prompts. Now, what's really interesting about what we're looking at here is the stark visual contrast in the themes the AI chose. On one side, when the AI wrote about Black women, the narratives were overwhelmingly locked into themes of ancestry, resilience, and inspiration. The characters were constantly carrying collective burdens. But on the flip side, for white women, the AI consistently generated themes of self-discovery, belonging, and new beginnings. It basically granted them individual freedom and the space for introspection. When we look at the actual text, the divide gets even deeper. In one story, we have a Black character, Anna, who is literally facing down arrogant, prejudiced attackers in the street, forced to use words of power and resistance. Meanwhile, in another story, we have Emily, a white character, whose biggest conflict is quitting her office job so she can study fine arts, paint in a local gallery, and, feel like a complete person. The AI completely defaults to trauma and societal struggle for the Black characters, while giving the white characters gentle introspection and the chance to reinvent themselves. The narrative divide here is absolutely massive. Black characters are constantly anchored to ancestry and expected to be these resilient role models facing down societal oppression. White characters, however, are granted the privilege of individuality. They are allowed to break away, start over, and discover new purposes. The algorithms are quite literally holding up a mirror to our own structural racism and societal essentialization. It's wild to see it laid out so clearly. The researchers actually have a name for this phenomenon. They call it representational memory. Basically, the AI is constructing identities based on crystallized historical expectations, rather than the limitless, actual lived reality of real people. It's like the AI traps marginalized groups in a loop of specific limiting narratives. The model essentially believes a Black woman's story must always be about fighting racism, which completely strips away her right to just be an individual navigating a complex world. Okay, moving to Section 4, blind spots in the machine. What happens when we ask the machine to reflect on its own work? Let's look at a really fascinating secondary experiment the researchers ran. So the researchers basically fed those generated stories right back into the GPT models and prompted them to audit the text. They essentially asked the AI, hey, is there any bias in this text? Rewrite it to remove the bias. The whole goal was to see if an automated system could reliably spot and clean up the very biases it just created. And this perfectly illustrates the absurdity of relying purely on automated ethics. When auditing a story that was heavily laden with racial stereotypes, the AI entirely missed the structural racism. Instead, it flagged the phrase Atlantic breeze as problematic because, wait for it, you can't make this up, it might exclude readers who don't live near an ocean. I mean, it completely missed the forest for the trees. It ignored the glaring erasure of individual agency and focused on a breeze. So why does it fail so spectacularly? Well, it's because large language models operate entirely on statistical correlations, not contextual human understanding. The AI is just relying on token probabilities. It doesn't actually comprehend the political or ideological nuances of the language it's using. It treats bias as the static, programmable math equation, when in reality, bias is a fluid, deeply human discursive resonance. Which brings us to our final section, rewriting the code. Where does all of this leave us? If the AI can't fix itself, how do we begin fixing the system? The study makes it incredibly clear that simple quantitative fixes will always fail. When the AI tried to fix the biased text, it just deleted details and paraphrased things. That diluted the narratives, sure, but it didn't actually remove the ideological harm. AI simply cannot detect those subtle discursive resonances. True auditing absolutely requires human, qualitative oversight, which is cannot outsource our ethical responsibilities to a machine that doesn't actually understand context. Our source material leaves us with this really powerful reminder. Language only becomes language in the presence of a subject. While these machines are frankly incredible at simulating discourse, at the end of the day, they are just calculating probabilities. Only human beings possess the intention, the historical memory, and the perspective to truly create meaning and change these narratives. So I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. If our machines are only going to repeat the stories we've already told, echoing our native speakerism, our historical biases, and our representational memories, how will we ever write a new one? It's really up to us to interrogate the invisible architectures in our own lives and actively choose the words that will shape our future. Thank you so much for joining me today, Focus Learners, and I will see you in the next explainer.